For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon de Rehove. Anthony Butler, editor of the book Remaking the ANC, joins me to discuss the unprecedented tests facing the African National Congress. The latest book which you have edited, Remaking the ANC, Party Change in South Africa and the Global South, explores how once dominant parties in a wide range of countries from the Global South respond to defeat or the threat of defeat. What motivated you to pull together a set of writing on this topic?
Well, I've been interested in what we could call the crisis in the ANC, a crisis of leadership, of loss of policy direction, of violence, money-fueled elections. And because the ANC is so important to the political future of South Africa, I've wanted to try to understand the implications of these internal conflicts and dysfunctions. And most of the comparisons that we make when we try to learn from the experiences of other countries in South Africa tend to be either African or European and American. And it seemed to me that we were not learning from countries that are in fact much more like South Africa than our immediate African neighbors, and certainly much more like South Africa than Western European countries or the United States. So these are countries that are middle-income developing countries with high levels of inequality, urbanization, very young populations, violence, displacement, corruption. So they're countries that are in lots of ways very familiar to us, but we don't think about them as being like South Africa. And there's a particular subset of countries that have something else in common with South Africa, which is that they have a party that's been in power for a long time, 2 decades or more. Cases like Mexico that we deal with in the book, where the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, was in power for about 60, 70 years from 1929. And other countries like Taiwan, where again the ruling party has been in power over decades. Now, in those 2 cases, the parties lost power, and then they gained it back again in a more competitive electoral system. And one thing that those cases seem to teach is, first of all, that you can lose if you're a dominant party and still come back, but also that losing, or the threat of losing, can change how parties organize themselves, the policies they adopt, how clean they are. So those 2 countries, and also Indian National Congress, which we look at in the book, are important studies. And we've also looked at some countries that have been offered as models, or some parties that have been offered as models for the ANC, such as the PT in Brazil and the Chinese Communist Party. And obviously they're not offered as all-round guides to action, but there are elements of their party organization, the way that they function, and the policies that they've adopted that have been advocated by people in COSATU and in different parts of the ANC leadership. So we have a range of countries that are like South Africa in relevantly similar ways, and we can learn from them.
In the case of the KMT in Taiwan, your book reflects that defeat has been the mother of all change, but that resurrection has been a dampener of reformist zeal. Please elaborate.
Some of the theories that political scientists use to explain why parties change dwell on the importance of the threat of defeat, or defeat itself. And there are a number of factors that can make a party change, but usually parties don't change easily. They're very big organizations. They become locked into patterns of behavior with factions that are dominant over quite long periods of time. And they find it hard to change their positions, their policies. Sometimes change can be brought about by a shift in leadership, or by a change in the factional politics of a major party. But what seems to be the most important impetus for change is losing. So quite often parties are not prepared for the defeat. They don't see it coming. And when they are defeated, then they realize they have to get their act together. And as we can see in the cases of many of these, what are called dominant parties that have been in power for 2 decades, when they lose, they are very often good at coming back. Sometimes they come back to a situation of controlling the government again. At other times, they become highly competitive parties that control provinces or regions, or they form coalitions with other parties. So formerly dominant parties can survive in competitive party systems. And the Taiwanese case is a fascinating one because they lost a little over a decade ago in a system that's a presidential system through more or less through a factional split and a breakaway. Nobody was expecting this defeat. And they changed a lot of their behavior as a result of losing. It took them time to regain the control of the presidency and of the legislature. Once they did so, they reverted more or less to their former behaviors. And in fact, you could argue that they've become more like their old selves than anyone could have believed. So when they were up against the wall, when they were defeated, they changed, but then they relapsed into their old ways once they were back in power.
Now, in Mexico, the long-ruling PRI lost power, but was then saved by a strategy of federalism. Do you see any potential parallels in the Mexican case with the relationship between the ANC in Gauteng and the ANC at a national level?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. The PRI was thrown into disarray by its loss of the presidency. And it had before that, it had lost control of certain provinces. The Mexican system is a federal system in which a lot of power is delegated to what the equivalent of the provinces, to the states. And that meant that already there was some shift in power occurring. But when they lost control of the national government and the presidency, there was a lot of division and uncertainty about how to respond. And it turned out, in part through trial and error and accident, that in some parts of Mexico, the PRI remained unified. So they didn't fall apart, as you would expect them to do in a situation in which you lose. For example, where the ANC lost in the Western Cape. They fell apart, they've been unable to come back. And it's partly losing patronage power, it's partly people desert. So once you've lost, they get out of the game and do something else. In Mexico, where the provincial parties remained unified, they were able to convince electors to vote for them again. And that helped to create the building blocks for the PRI to come back at national level and take control again. Now, the strategy of federalism that's described by our authors in that chapter, Kane Green and Hector Ibarra, was in some respects not so much a strategy as a series of accidents, that some provinces managed to seize power by confronting the center. And that allowed them to deal more effectively with their own electorates. The provinces in Mexico, the states in Mexico, are very diverse, very much like the provinces in South Africa. They have different electorates, different class structure, different kinds of issues that are relevant to electors. And what that conflict between the center and the provinces allowed was the provincial parties to remain unified and focused on attracting electors in their region. Had there not been that confrontation in advance of their defeat, they wouldn't have been able to come back, because there was no way that the center could put together a strategy of recovery on its own. And I think there's something important for the ANC to learn about that the questions that people ask of the ANC in Gauteng are very different to the questions that they ask in Limpopo or in KZN. And by seizing the opportunity to speak with its own voice, to insist on having its own candidate as premier, what Gauteng is doing is making it possible for itself to win, to continue to win. further imposition of unpopular candidates by the centre, like the previous premier, would doom the ANC to defeat. So by sharing power, the centre can in fact allow the ANC to continue to govern for longer and more effectively.
It is argued that the PT, or Workers' Party of Brazil, which was hailed by some as a party of the left, has now been taken over by moderate factions. Is this comparable with the ANC's shift to more centrist policies in South Africa?
I think there are many similarities. I think that parties in competitive political systems where people vote, they have to find the middle ground in politics. They can't become extremists. Then they're forcing themselves into a position of unelectability. And the PT and the ANC alike have to steer a middle course when it comes to public policy if they're going to retain the support of the electorate. Although trade unions like to portray themselves as ordinary people, in fact in both societies organised trade unionists are privileged with high incomes, permanent employment and so on. To privilege their interests at the expense of the broader population would be electorally damaging. And I think there are very big differences though. And one difference is it's not so much that the ANC is finding a centre, it's that the ANC really is divided now by class. So it has a large number of very wealthy business people in it, a very even larger number of not so wealthy business people at provincial and local level, as well as its traditional constituencies in the trade union movement. And those constituencies themselves are increasingly divided because the logics of public sector trade unions and private industrial and manufacturing unions are quite different. So the ANC is being torn apart not just by a need to appeal to the centre, but also by its internal dynamics. PT is more coherent as a party, partly because it's smaller in terms of its electoral catchment pool. So it's not a party that's ever going to secure 66% of the vote. It wins presidential elections, has just done so again, but it's not a majority party in the country. And that means that its focus can be more on the interests of workers and on leftist ideologues as well. One difference in Brazil is that the union movement is very pragmatic. So in PT, it's the unionists who are steering more of a middle course, and it's the intellectuals who are constantly trying to pull the PT to the left. And I think the recent development suggests that the party is becoming increasingly pragmatic, and it's losing some of its appeal for that reason, I think, particularly to people on the left, that it's no longer strongly redistributive in character. But I think that's also an important reason behind its continued electoral success.
The Chinese model of state-led development appeals to some in the ANC, but your book includes a chapter that argues that the Chinese Communist Party has used new technologies to, amongst other things, shape public opinion and bolster control by the party. Please elaborate.
The Chinese model is very different to anything we see in South Africa or most of the other cases in this book. There are many parallels with Taiwan, particularly because the party controls the state. The party is dominant over the state at all levels. And so although we call it a state-driven model, it's in fact a party-driven model. Another difference is that there has been very little room for competition, party competition. The Communist Party isn't willing to allow competition. Where it's willing to allow elections, it's begun at very local level to allow different candidates to stand, but not parties to compete with one another. So the political context is a very different one. I think that the Communist Party has a different understanding of how to remain legitimate. And that understanding is based partly around performance. So it has to have a growing economy, increasing purchasing power for citizens. That is what allows them to accept their political disempowerment, I guess. But also they need to clamp down on corruption. So there's a massive problem of corruption in China, particularly at local level. And you can see that in the opinion polls that there are, which are unreliable in China as elsewhere, that people are very dissatisfied with their local politicians. They believe that their municipal politicians are crooks, and they are. They tend, however, to view the senior leadership of the Communist Party through a different lens, and they view them as being on their side, but unable to intervene in local circumstances. And one thing the party has been able to do is to use its control over the internet in China. So in China, they don't allow the Western internet providers access. You can't use your Facebook in China. But they provide a party-controlled and censored alternative. One of the mechanisms that's used, one of the mechanisms that allows is for the party to control citizen complaint about public service delivery or local corruption. So people can email in their concerns, and if those concerns are about local politicians, then the party can crack down and root out people who are causing the legitimacy of the party as a whole to come into disrepute. If the complaints are about Tiananmen Square or the lack of democracy or about what's happening in Hong Kong, it just disappears. It's censored out of the system. So they're using the internet selectively to try to build the legitimacy of the party and to address problems in local service delivery. And this is clearly appealing to some people in the ANC, that they think perhaps there's a shortcut to addressing problems in local service delivery and the protest that causes. But it's not so straightforward, I don't think. I think it's taken a huge investment and very high levels of scientific and technological know-how to get these systems into place.
It is argued in your book that factionalism in the Indian Congress Party has degenerated to an extent that the focus of political life has shifted from contests with other parties to internal battles for position. This discrimination sounds directly applicable to current conditions in South Africa's ANC-led alliance. Would you agree?
One of the fascinating things about discussing all of these cases with the authors that are here today from these many different middle-income countries is that we've all been talking about factionalism. And factionalism is a feature of political parties everywhere, but particularly these big parties that have been in control of government resources over long periods of time. So it's a combination of division within parties and resources being at the heart of those divisions. It's not just resource-driven factionalism, because factions are sometimes also created by ideological differences or by regional differences, ethnic, linguistic. There are a variety of possible causes of factionalism, but all big parties suffer from it. And in most of these dominant party cases, over time, the initial unifying factors fade. So often that is an anti-colonial struggle or a revolutionary struggle in the Mexican case. Over time, the initial drivers of unity fade away, but the competition for resources and position continues. And so the factional conflict tends to become increasingly predominant within the parties. And in these cases, because the parties are dominant, it is the internal political processes of the parties that decide who governs and who gets what. So the elections, the candidate list processes and so on become a real focus of political competition. People fight increasingly, and eventually the parties, unless they can figure out mechanisms for averting it, they begin to tear themselves apart around resources and position and power.
About the ANC, your book reflects on the sins of incumbency, weak membership systems, and rising factionalism. When all such problems are taken into account, what possible futures do you see for the ANC?
That's a very difficult question to answer. One thing that looking at these cases has taught all of us in our discussions is that there are many different ways that parties can respond to factionalism, to problems of organization, and to the threat of defeat or to defeat itself. They can change the way they function as organizations, they can change their policies, they can attempt to genuinely to root out as much corruption as they can, to introduce new kinds of systems for making the public policy more coherent. Or they can move in an anti-competitive direction. So political parties can try to remove that threat of electoral defeat by rigging elections, by preventing electoral commissions from functioning, by preventing the media from covering election campaigns, and by using resources. Because money is a big factor in politics in all of these countries, and these parties have control over resources from private companies, but also from parastatals and from the state. They all have ways of milking the public sector and their control over it. And some of our authors feel that that's a key to the success of those parties. So the ANC has choices about how it responds. I think one key change that has to come about is that the membership systems, the list processes, the leadership elections, and the deliberation over policy has to become more disciplined and coherent. We've seen in recent years the membership of the ANC rising from around 400,000, where it was in the Mbeki years, to 1.2 million members, many of whom may not exist. They may simply be on paper. And there may be many members of the ANC who have paid for their membership cards but are not recognized by the ANC as members. If those problems of internal membership systems are not sorted out, then we will keep moving from electoral cycle to electoral cycle through these periods of factional conflict, where people are fighting to get on lists, they're using money to get on lists, and then every 5 years you have these huge factional conflicts developing around the leadership positions in the ANC. And all of these elections are they don't just have a significant resources or financial component, they're increasingly driven by money. And the presidency is one part of that. It's too big to lose in South Africa, but there are lots of other offices in South Africa that people want to win so that they can safeguard their resources and acquire further resources. So a way has to be found to make these systems do what they're meant to do in the ANC constitution. It's very important to have what you have on paper, which is a system that is internally democratic, where ordinary members can kick out their leader, where they can play a significant role in deciding who their candidates are. None of these parties is perfect remotely. All of these parties have similar problems with money, with factional conflict, but there has to be some discipline, some control over how these processes are conducted. And that's going to take a really big effort on the part of the ANC leadership, because we've reached a situation now where people at provincial level and local level in the ANC have reached positions of power through money politics. And they don't want things to change. They don't want doing business with the state to be banned. They don't want the electoral system to be cleaned up because they're beneficiaries of a crooked electoral system. They are the people who manipulate whether branches are accredited when it comes to conference time. Yeah. And so it's going to be hard to turn the ANC around, I think, but it doesn't mean it's impossible.
That was Anthony Butler, Professor of Political Studies at UCT, discussing the book Remaking the ANC.